Today we are taking another look at the tale of Benjamin Bunny, but this time we're going to focus on some different things, like the main idea, which is the big idea in the story, and the details, which is the how, what, when, why, where, how of the main idea. And we're also going to be looking at sequencing, and that's the time order of events in a story. We're going to talk about the plot, which is the beginning, the middle, the end of the story, and also going to look at character, which would be the person or the animal that's in the story. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trit trot of a pony. A gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip, and a jump to call upon his relations, who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. All right, let's just talk about sequence here, because on these 2 pages, a lot of things have happened. As we read, we need to pay attention to the order of events, and the author is describing what happens first. A little rabbit sits and listens for the pony to pass. What word tells the reader when this is happening? Do you see it? It says one morning, so we know what time it is even. Then what happens next? Well, Mr. and Mrs. McGregor pass the rabbit while they're driving in their little horse and buggy. What phrase tells the reader that the bunny waits for Mr. and Mrs. McGregor to pass? And it says, as soon as they had passed. So that says, as soon as they went by, immediately he did what? He went to look for his family that's at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Mrs. Rabbit earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffetees. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly, and he was dressed in a red cotton handkerchief. All right, so let's talk about plot for a second. Now, plot is the beginning, middle, and end of the story. So we're looking right now at the beginning. What is the beginning problem that we see that happened in the story? Because the beginning, that's where the problem happens. And then in the middle, that's all the action. All right. And in the end, the problem gets solved. So let's see, what's our problem here? Well, it's his cousin Peter. He's not looking good. Remember, he'd lost his clothes in Mr. McGregor's garden, and now he's just wrapped in a handkerchief. Peter, said little Benjamin in a whisper, who has got your clothes? Peter replied, the scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old hat of Mr. McGregor's. So they found his clothes. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes in order that they might be able to use the handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night. There was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the hat, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they should fill the handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home and ate a lettuce leaf. The lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said they should like to go home. Presently, he dropped half the onions. All right, let's stop right here, and we're going to talk about the character of Benjamin Bunny, all right? Well, how do we learn about what a character is like? Well, the author has them do and say and think things that he lets us know about. So let's look at what he's given us that describes Benjamin Bunny. It says he's going to bring a present to his aunt. He eats the lettuce in the garden, and he says he feels right at home doing it. So, what are some words that we could use to describe someone who brings presents to other people and who feels right at home? Well, we could say that they were kind and thoughtful. If someone who brings presents, right? And someone who feels right at home is probably happy and relaxed. So, just the things that he describes about Benjamin Bunny lets us know this about the character. Little Benjamin led the way along a little walk on planks under a sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on their doorsteps cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises, worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. All right, let's talk about sequence. Sequence is the time order of events in the story. And I want you just to think about what's happening on page 16 and 17. All right, think about what's happened through this part of the story. What happened first? Well, little Benjamin Bunny leads Peter along the walkway. What happens next? They walk past some mice that are cracking cherry stones and they wink at them. What happens after that? Peter hears some bad noises and his eyes are getting big. Now, what happens last? Well, then Benjamin and Peter stop moving. I wonder why they stopped suddenly. This is what those little rabbits saw around that corner. So now we know why they had to stop suddenly, because there is a cat. Little Benjamin took one look. Then, in half a minute less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. All right, so let's think about what the main idea on pages 18 and 19 would be. What is the big event that happens on that page? The cat, right? They ran into the cat. That's the big idea. And then all of those other things kind of support that. They hid. She came and she sniffed at the basket. She stretched herself. Maybe she liked the smell of onions. And then she sat down on the basket. Those are the details. But the big idea is that they ran into a cat. And now it's trouble. She sat there for 5 hours. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon. But still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was looking for his son. Now remember that old Mr. Benjamin Bunny is the father of little Benjamin Bunny, right? He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall on the top of the cat and pushed it off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears. Then he took out his nephew Peter. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned, he observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too little. Also, he could not understand how the cat had shut herself up inside the greenhouse. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling with the bunches of herbs. All right, so now let's think about the plot. All right, so what happened at the beginning of the story? Remember the problem? Peter wasn't looking good because he had lost his clothes, and they were on the scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden. Now, how did little Benjamin and Peter try to solve the problem? Well, they went right into Mr. McGregor's garden and got those clothes back from the scarecrow. Did they run into any trouble as they tried to solve the problem? Oh, yes, they ran into a cat, and they had to hide under that basket for like 5 hours. And then who helped little Benjamin and Peter get away from the cat? Well, old Mr. Benjamin Bunny did, right? He kicked the cat off of the basket and locked him in the greenhouse. So all of those actions, all of those things in the middle, that's that middle part of our story. Now, at the end of our story, how did the story end? Well, Mother forgave Peter because he got his shoes and coat back, and Cottontail and Peter put away the red handkerchief, and then Mrs. Rabbit hung up the onions that she had gotten as a present. So, before I let you go, we do need to talk about a couple more of our vocabulary words. First one is corner. This is what those little rabbits saw around that corner. So they came around the corner and saw that cat, right?
Corner. The place where two paths come together. We meet at the corner. We meet where two paths cross. Corner.
All right, corner, where two paths come together. That time it was little Peter's path and the cat's path, right? Your next word is above, above. Some bits of mortar fell from the wall above.
Above. In a higher place. We lift the trophy above our heads. Above.
So someplace above the cat, little bits of mortar fell off of that wall and fell onto the cat. The next word is the word tremendous. He took a tremendous jump off the wall.
Tremendous. Tremendous.
All right, so very large or great. He took a tremendous jump. He took a very large jump. Tremendous means the same thing as very large. And our last vocabulary that we have to talk about is the word greenhouse. And it said that he pushed the cat off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse.
Greenhouse. A building with walls and sides made of glass where plants can be grown all year long. The greenhouse is filled with plants. It is warm inside all year. Greenhouse.
So some of you may have been to a greenhouse to buy plants or flowers with Mom, but Mr. McGregor had a greenhouse in his garden so that he could grow his vegetables even in the wintertime because the walls are made of glass. You can see through them. They're made of windows, so they still get lots of sunlight and it stays warm in there. All right, that's all I have for you today. Tomorrow we will definitely have a test where we talk about all of the things that we talked about today about plot and character and the time order of events and all of that vocabulary as well.